okay so that there'll be access to this recording afterwards. So that's the basic setup for this system. So, with no further ado, I'd like to introduce David Antle. David recently completed his PhD last year at McGill University and is now working as EWI Works Research Director. We're very happy to have him out here in the West. He's up in Edmonton. And I'm going to turn it over to David now to maximize the time for this presentation. So, welcome, David, and thanks very much for doing this for us. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Margot. You can hear me okay, right?
Yeah, everything's coming through great.
Excellent. Thanks everyone for taking the time to come here today and take part in this webinar. This is kind of a new experience for me. I've done one thing like this before, but I find it a little odd being in a room talking to myself, yet there are 30 plus people listening to me. So bear with me if it's a little bit weird for me to present this, and hopefully it comes across okay. What we're going to talk about today is the idea of using participatory ergonomics as an effective approach for workplace intervention. And before we get started, I'd like to recognize the contributions of some people to this project as a whole. In particular, I think Dr. Nicole Vesna may be even joining us right now on the webinar. She had a huge role in the projects we'll talk about through this presentation, and she was actually one of my supervisors for my PhD, and I learned quite a bit from her, so she clearly has a hand in this, as well as Dr. Barbara Neese, Dr. John Mulgard, and Dr. Scott McKinnon at the Memorial University in Newfoundland and the Safety Net Center for Occupational Health and Safety Research, and also Linda Sagmeister, who I think a lot of us know, who works for government services in Newfoundland as their ergonomist. She had quite a big role to play as well. So I guess we can all get on the same page with the fact that we've done a pretty good job of identifying risk factors to deal with work-related injuries and work-related musculoskeletal disorders. But really what we need to do is find a way to make this more applicable for industry. As musculoskeletal disorders are a major burden to us from a financial standpoint and a societal standpoint, I mean, I think the new statistics are 34% of all lost time claims in North America are sprain and strain or musculoskeletal disorder or repetitive strain, whatever term you choose to use. I believe that's now the standard for the number that are claimed every year. And traditionally, as ergonomists, when we deal with musculoskeletal disorders, we would take an expert approach where we mix in some quantitative experimental studies and some standards that were developed through field work and laboratory studies, mostly involving occupational biomechanics, work physiology, cognitive processing, and a whole host of other fields. And it really became almost a way of overusing the idea of fitting a task to a worker. And there was an overabundance of applying general standards and human factors issues and guidelines into the equation. The problem with that is that injuries themselves are not just physically based, and they're not just always fall into these nice categories from time to time. Injuries themselves are rather multifactored, and they involve physical, psychosocial, organizational constructs. And further with that, a lot of the times we get our information for these particular standards and guidelines based on laboratory studies or short field studies that are really based on quantitative efforts. And these can be very valuable to provide some underlying information, but oftentimes they're not entirely consistent with the reality of the work that's performed. And oftentimes there's a disconnect between what practitioners need and what end users in industry actually need and what's actually out there. And the truth is, if we really want to get to the fundamental issues surrounding musculoskeletal disorders and prevent them, we need to understand things from a more macro level, using a systemic approach. And getting perspective on those multiple areas, we really need to consider the fact that as outside consultants or researchers or even internal ergonomists who don't necessarily have intimate knowledge of the work, we need to involve other key players in the activities. And that social interaction and gaining knowledge from them is really important to make sure that we can get that information. And that led to kind of adaptation in our approaches to ergonomics. And I guess we could trace that back in the 1960s in France and Quebec. There was evolution of social ergonomic intervention approaches. And at the same time, in Japan, there was these idea of quality circles where you involve workers who complete the work in redesigning and improving the processes. And these kind of evolved and moved forward and into the 1980s and across Europe, where things became focused on participatory workplace design. And from there, the term participatory ergonomics started to evolve and be used as a way to describe ergonomics interventions that involve workers in this social manner. And that's proliferated since then to be what we now often term as participatory ergonomics. And the reason this is a great way to do things is essentially participatory ergonomics is a way of doing a systematic approach to dealing with these particular issues. And I'm sure you're all aware of this. I mean, lots of us have had courses on this particular topic, but conducting a participatory ergonomics intervention means involving stakeholders in the company at all phases of an intervention. And that includes people from all different levels, from management to employee, from maintenance, technical support, a number of different areas. And they can be involved in any number of ways, including but not limited to education, selecting areas where they're having particular problems, assessing the issues, developing solutions, and evaluation. And the idea is by having those stakeholders involved, we can get to a point where they help us to understand the organizational issues, the social interaction issues, and we combine their knowledge with the knowledge that we have from an ergonomic standpoint and from a scientific standpoint in a lot of cases to identify ways we can reach effective solutions. Most oftentimes when we talk about participatory ergonomics, it's the idea of using an ergonomics team, where now instead of being purely the expert at the top of the chain when it comes to developing ergonomic solutions, the ergonomist moves into more of a role of a facilitator, and they guide not only the development of that team, but the progression of that team as it deals with specific issues. They select areas where they want to deal with problems, they conduct the analysis, they interview their peers, synthesize information, and ultimately propose solutions. And the strengths that have been noted by using that particular ergonomics team approach are improved communication to understand what the issues are and what needs to be done to fix them. You get improved employee buy-in rather than having an external person or someone who doesn't necessarily complete the work tell them what needs to be done. The workers and management feel like they had a hand in developing that particular solution. And perhaps most importantly, you get that contextual knowledge as to what's really going on, not only from what you see from observation over, a few hours or days, but you really understand their experience and history of the work and all the elements that go into it. And hopefully, by having these people involved along the way, we develop some sort of sustainability and some capacity to understand and use ergonomics in their day-to-day operations. Now, this all sounds well and good, and it does prove to be a pretty effective approach when done correctly and you have the right people involved. But there are some difficulties associated with the participatory ergonomic solutions and interventions. First and foremost, we need to better understand how to develop those partnerships, train our stakeholders, gather knowledge, apply solutions, perform evaluations, and all elements of actually running this type of model. And while there's been a history in maybe in French and across Europe in terms of using these particular approaches, the proliferation of resources related to participatory ergonomics has really only been going on since the 1990s. So that's a relatively short time frame, and worldwide there's a relatively small group of researchers that work on this. So we need to be able to gather some information in terms of best practice from maybe some external sources as well. The other thing to remember is participatory ergonomics is sometimes criticized from a quantitative standpoint. There's often claims that there's not a lot of scientific evaluation or fundamental ways to evaluate what's going on there. And that may be true, but I think we have to get away from thinking about analysis as purely something quantitative, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. So we need to overcome these specific issues. Some other difficulties we might have with participatory ergonomics is the process is relatively time consuming and difficult for someone to perform if they're not experienced in doing so. Negotiating participation of stakeholders takes skill. You need to understand participatory reaction research paradigms, and knowledge transfer and dissemination are pretty core to the entirety of the process. And although we have a lot of models and guidelines and facilitative factors and roadmaps for participatory ergonomics out there, a lot of these come from academic articles and different sources throughout the country and internationally, and it's relatively hard to really get a sense of what to do in a short communication that's 10 to 15 pages long. Compounding the problem is the fact that training related to an ergo team is relatively poorly described in the literature, and we might need better a sense of what we need to give to our stakeholders in terms of information and background and skills and tools. So if as a practicing ergonomist, we'd all maybe like to have some better pieces to put in place to guide these particular interventions. And furthermore, any company stakeholder or manager that would be interested in investing in such a process, they'd probably like to see some roadmap and some tools to help overcome these specific problems. So what I want to talk to you guys about today is what can we do to overcome some of these barriers associated with participatory ergonomics? Well, one of the things we could do is maybe try to learn from participatory research models and paradigms that are in existence in other fields, particularly in public and community health and medicine. And also, I'd like to talk to you about some projects that evolved over the last 6 to 8 years, along with Dr. Vesna and the team at SafetyNet, to actually put together some guidelines and tools for running these specific types of interventions. And finally, I'd like to leave with a note as to where we go from here. How do we adapt these tools and actually use them in other industries beyond where they have been applied thus far? So the first phase of this presentation, I'd like to talk about the symmetry that exists between community-based participatory action research and the idea of participatory ergonomics. I think there's a lot of exchange that could happen between these two fields. So for anyone who's unfamiliar with it, community-based participatory action research is pretty common. It's used in medicine, population health, community health, health promotion, and that's something we can really learn from because it's a key component to moving knowledge into action. And in our field, in ergonomics and occupational health, we're often criticized for using participatory approaches and these intervention evidence-based models. But if they're good enough to be used in the larger community of public health and medicine, maybe we could take some lessons from them to justify our own approaches. So I really believe that there's a lot of interaction between these two different fields. In participatory action research, the idea is that you want to enhance the amount of understanding you have for the social and cultural dynamics within a community. And you try to integrate the knowledge that you gain from those people into their larger profile in terms of taking care of their own health and wellness. If you are able to develop knowledge and capacity among that stakeholder group, ultimately you lead to some sort of sustainability in that community to continue to take care of their health and a specific issue going forward. That sounds relatively similar to what we want to do in ergonomics. We want to involve stakeholders to help us understand organizational requirements, psychosocial factors, and I get an idea of how to adapt solutions to be more consistent with work. We want to make sure that they buy in. We want to train them so they understand ergonomics and lead them with some sustainable capacity as well. So there's a lot of crossover between these. So given that participatory ergonomics and participatory action research in a larger forum can have some symmetry, what I wanted to look at as part of my comprehensive exam process during my PhD was, are there opportunities where participatory ergonomics can learn from larger participatory research and vice versa? What could potentially participatory ergonomics add to that larger community? So what I'd like to do there is explain that where these come together. So some lessons I gained in terms of what I think ergonomics could learn from participatory action research is, first of all, how to gain partnership. We know that researchers and practitioners in ergonomics often struggle to develop socially constructed partnerships. And although we have some models and guidelines, there's not really a lot of specific information on fostering those partnerships. But we can take some information from the health research side in terms of what they do. And there's been a long history of developing some projects there. When I was at McGill University, I actually met some people who ran some participatory research interventions with diabetes among First Nations communities, and some health promotion in terms of obesity reduction and improved physical activity as well. These are all really interesting, and they were following a lot of this, running into the same barriers and same problems we do. So I looked at some of the research that existed in that forum. And what they suggest is to help guide you to developing that initial communication and fostering participation. Some things you want to do is, first of all, agree over what your operating norms are going to be. Identify what your common goals and objectives are going to be throughout a project. Ensure you have democratic leadership and representation. Ensure you have the presence of a community organizer. Involve your support staff. Ensure there are opportunities for the researchers to explain why they're there and what they can bring in terms of their competencies and skills. Identify opportunities to investigate prior involvement in community research. This is really important. A lot of times, even in workplaces, we run into the fact that they've dealt with previous research projects related to ergonomics or dealt with previous practitioners, and maybe their experience was not exactly what they wanted, and they might have some negative connotations in terms of what the project means. Or on the other side, they may be have had a previously wonderful experience, and they may have some previous value that you could take from that. So learning about the history can be important. And finally, identify opportunities to identify key members in that community that are going to take the role here. So sort of identifying your champions and your key stakeholders that you're going to want to involve as leaders in this whole process. Another thing I think we can take away from the larger participatory action research literature is the idea of ethical considerations. And although we have a nice code of ethics for our national association, this is great, and it's directly to deal with in terms of interacting with other ergonomists and whatnot. But we also need to consider how people involved in a project are going to interact and have deal with their specific ethical obligations. It's been long noted in that community-based participatory action research side that strong ethical practices actually improve the quality of the training, the development of infrastructure, data collection, storage, and even capacity building. So some of the key ethical issues we want to make sure that we take into account in these projects are, one, first and foremost, we want to make sure that the issue that we're dealing with is community-driven. We can't just go in with a preconceived notion of this is what the problems are and this is what I want to look at, this is what I want to study. That might not necessarily be consistent with what the community members want to look at. So you have to make sure that there's some consideration of what they want as well. Also consider the fact that there might be insider-outsider tensions. Are the community members fearful of the researchers or practitioners? Are the researchers or practitioners willing to give up some of the power they have and make sure that everybody has a say in what's going on? And make sure that there are no pressures on particular groups to take part. Oftentimes in our projects, particularly running participatory interventions, we assume that everybody wants to take part and that everybody would want to be involved. But we have to make sure that their participation is not being coerced or they feel like they have to take part because their job may be dependent on it or something to that effect. We also want to consider racism and cultural humility. We want to make sure that we're not isolating any particular group or subgroup that might be performing one particular task, or in some workplaces where there are immigrant communities, there may be particular groups that stick together, and you want to make sure that you involve some members from each of those groups. We also really need to recognize that participation has its limits, and when we involve people in these projects, it can't take away to add more work to their day. Just if they're having time away from their regular work to take part in an ergonomics team or something to that effect, that's great, but they shouldn't have to then work overtime to make up for the fact that they were away from the line. Nor should they have to take homework or particular things home with them from being involved with the ergonomics project. We should make sure that we don't put extra stress on these people. And finally, and this is more for the research side of things in a lot of cases, but how are you going to share your findings in terms of if you're going to publish it and disseminate it to a wider community beyond the group you're working with? You need to make sure that's completely spelled out and everybody's comfortable with it and they've given their sign off. Another thing we can learn from the larger participatory research community is the idea of building capacity. And that's really what the goal is. We want to get to a point where there's some knowledge and ability at the workplace to maintain our interventions even when the ergonomist can't be there. Well, that can sometimes be difficult, and it's often implied, and we want to make sure it's there, but we really do lack ways of tracking how our capacity is being built and how successful we are at it. But this is a much more defined concept in community health and population health that use participatory research models. And we could just take one simple example here. And they point out that sometimes you need to look at it in terms of how capacity is built at multiple levels. Are you going to build capacity from the bottom up in a community or a workplace? Are you going to start with management and work top down? Are you going to foster partnerships between various levels? Or are you going to try to get to a point where there's a community organization approach where members from different factions come together to do it? And these are very well spelled out in the participatory action research literature. And we could do an entire presentation just on these 4 concepts. But I invite you to go look at some of this literature and recognize the fact that oftentimes we need to work at different levels to develop the first, second, and third pieces here throughout a life of a participatory ergonomics or participatory research project. So ultimately, we get to the 4th phase, that ergo team type approach where we have that community organization and factions from different groups taking part. They also suggest using several categories to evaluate capacity building. Again, I can invite you to evaluate each of these individually by looking at the articles, because we could go through the entire presentation just on this concept. Now, I also want to give our own field a lot of credit, because I think we've done some excellent work in participatory ergonomics, and that could add to the larger research community. But unfortunately, a lot of the times when they do reviews of participatory research and intervention research and evidence-based research, there's lots of stuff in there from a variety of different fields, but I've never really seen any ergonomics articles included in those reviews. But I think we can be helpful. First of all, in a review of participatory action research in a larger health forum, they noted that some of the barriers and some of the problems are providing training for community partners and having the resources and tools to develop their community partners' skills. Well, this is something we have some history and some ability with in ergonomics. We've noted in some participatory ergonomics articles that there are strategies and certain processes you can put in place to overcome time management issues. We have models of train to trainer and peer-to-peer training that work quite well in ergonomics and fit within that participatory context. And there's even some tools out there that do have some resources regarding organizational support structures, developing learning cultures, providing training. Lots of these pieces are out there. Another thing that's often mentioned is that in the larger participatory action research community, conducting community assessments and diagnostics is a key component of doing this, but they don't necessarily have a lot of models or structure to do it. But in ergonomics, we do have some tools and approaches that might at least provide a roadmap in terms of how they might want to do this. So I just wanted some conclusions from this particular section. There are certainly some lessons and guidelines that participatory action research and participatory ergonomics share, and we can really use the two of them together to justify our approaches and make a larger base of evidence to show that these participatory models are useful. And I think that it would be very good for us to start including in our graduate programs in ergonomics a larger sense of including participatory action research paradigms and knowledge translation and evidence-based approaches as part of our training. I think that would be useful to us as practitioners and researchers. And I think that's where we want to eventually get to. And on the other side of things, I think we could start to even promote our own selves in terms of how participatory ergonomics might fit into case studies and training in that more community health-based approaches. Anybody who's involved with research or follows what's going on knows that health research has come to a point where there's quite a revolution going on, where knowledge translation and evidence-based work is becoming very important. And I think that a lot of the work that's done in ergonomics and occupational health can be valuable to provide evidence that this stuff works. And I think we need to be better at promoting that in a larger forum, not just to our own community of ergonomists and occupational health and safety professionals, but promote it to the larger health community, that our models of participation are following the same principles as yours and oftentimes leading to some really cool outcomes. So if we look back at some of those barriers I mentioned right at the beginning of the presentation, the need to better have a larger base of research to guide us, overcoming criticisms in terms of not having evaluations and not having a quantitative approach. Well, I think we've overcome this. A lot of recognizing that we can borrow and use other pieces of the puzzle from the larger participatory research community can help overcome a lot of this. But we still have these that I mentioned, the process being time consuming, We need a more extensive guideline package and training package and things like this. So this is where we need to focus now. And to do that, I'd like to outline the project that I was fortunate enough to work with the larger team that I alluded to earlier. And I'd like to outline for you how that package was developed in terms of guiding participatory ergonomic interventions, how it might be used, and where we need to go with it, and where I hope to involve everyone who's listening to this who might be involved or wish to use it going forward into refining and improving that particular toolkit. So I originally come from Newfoundland and Labrador, and while it's not particularly this way anymore, a lot of the fish processing plants have since closed, but in the rural environments, at least maybe 5 to 10 years ago, in rural environments in that province, fish processing remained the main resource, and not just harvesting, but actually taking it to processing plants, and provided a lot of work for those tiny communities. But it was often a boom or bust production system where there'd be really intense periods of spring and summer production and then long layoffs. So that leads to some work conditioning factors and some difficulty in terms of long hours during the in-season, and combine that with the fact that it's a relatively older population of workers. A lot of the younger people have left these communities. So with all this together, they were starting to see much higher incidences of work-related musculoskeletal disorders. And that's not surprising because we know that food processing work is associated with developing these particular disorders. And while they recognized that ergonomics could help, there's often a lack of resources for consistent use of those services and attaining the proper professionals. Compounding the problem is the fact that public resources are rather limited. Given the distance that our provincial ergonomists would have to travel, it's difficult to provide the services in a public forum as well. So we began to consider the fact that what if participatory ergonomics were to be an answer? What if we could have resources available and we could build capacity to improve ergonomics in these workplaces so they can maintain their operations and maintain the economy and employment in these small communities, and this momentum could be achieved between visits of outside researchers or publicly funded professionals who can help out. So the project was undertaken by the Safety Net Center for Occupational Health and Safety Research at Memorial University, and they were fortunate enough to receive some Canadian Institutes of Health research funding under the Knowledge to Action program. And the idea was we would eventually look at how we could develop some participatory approaches. The way we did that, we took information from several sources. First of all, we, of course, went to the academic literature to be able to provide some background reading and some underlying theoretical concepts. But the most important part was probably partnering with Dr. Vesna at the University of Quebec in Montreal, where she has a professional master's program in ergonomics. And we were able to involve her in the project, and she was able to show us a lot of the things that would need to be put in place and guide us through to teach us how to run this particular type of project. And while we were learning from Dr. Vesna and reading all this literature, we decided we would capture what was going on at a seafood processing plant in Newfoundland and Labrador, where we tried to run this particular program. So our methodology broke down like this. We reviewed academic literature in ergonomics, participatory action research, knowledge translation, and we identified models, approaches, success factors, barriers that might exist that need to be taken into account if you wanted to run a participatory ergonomic ergo team model. We then followed very closely and very intently listened to what Dr. Vesna was teaching us, and she guided us during the first participatory ergonomic intervention at this seafood processing plant. We followed the approach that she teaches in her program and tried to really absorb what was going on. All the while, we were paying attention in terms of what members of the ergo team, what the stakeholders that we were involving in the project at the plant, what did they need to do? Well, they needed to analyze risk factors, they needed to interview and interact with their peers, compile the information, develop solutions, report to management, and to do that, they needed specific sets of skills. First of all, they needed to have some conception and understanding of ergonomics and motion description. They needed to understand their ethical considerations. They needed to have skills regarding video recording and analysis, using their computer, problem-solving skills, interview skills, and a whole host of other things. So taking all this into account, we were able to get some feedback on the training steps from the people involved in that initial project, those stakeholders. They told us where they thought they needed more training and where they thought the training we provided was adequate and what we should change. From that, we were able to take that feedback, our field notes, and produce some training documents. And we developed a draft package in terms of a guideline for running this particular project and a training package that could be used in a second processing plant. So that's what we did. This time, Dr. Vesna again guided us, but this time from afar, and let us run things on the ground in Newfoundland, and she provided some periodic visits. By doing that, we developed then a preliminary draft guidebook, model, and set of tools that we took to a panel at the 2007 Primus Conference in Boston, Massachusetts. And we had participatory ergonomics experts from across Canada and even a couple international researchers look through our tools and give us some feedback in terms of what we should refine and change. We then took that package and applied it again in two urban contexts this time, at a chicken processing plant in St. John's, Newfoundland, and a snack bar processing plant in Montreal, Quebec. Again, by running through this process another couple of times, the tools were refined once again. We adapted the training steps, added pieces, clarified some things, and produced a finalized package, which we entitled a team approach. It's a participatory ergonomics guidebook and toolkit that's available as an open source document to anybody who wishes to find it at www.participatoryergonomics.mun.ca. That package includes a promotional video, which explains to stakeholders at the plant what the process entails, what their roles would be, and what they have to commit to going forward. It also contains a user guide, which summarizes some key literature, outlines the roles of the ergonomists and the various stakeholders, identifies success factors and potential issues that could crop up, and outlines very comprehensively, I think, what needs to be done in each of these steps. While it is written for use by an ergonomist or someone who would like to run this particular style of intervention, it's also really useful for managers, occupational health and safety reps, and rehabilitation specialists, and union representatives, and other people that would like to know more about the process to move forward. In that guidebook, our model is based on 7 phases, from preparation to investigation to diagnosis of problems, to proposition of solutions, to reporting, to implementation, and to evaluation. All within these phases, there are 22 specific steps that are outlined in the guide, giving you a map of where to follow to actually accomplish this particular intervention style. We also included a training workbook and set of accompanying tools. It's split into 12 different modules with activities and teaching aids and PowerPoints and key tools along the way to help get the stakeholders that you involve in this process up to speed so they have what they need to perform. The 12 modules we included are: what is an ergo team, confidentiality agreements and on ethics and privacy and things like this, how to identify areas in need of analysis and using body discomfort surveys, recruiting volunteers and performing worker interviews, capturing video, some basic ergonomics, video analysis, job analysis, performing interviews, developing reports and recommendations, evaluation of the implementations, and how to move forward with your team. I think the strengths of this package are the fact that we include some perspectives from French and English views on participatory ergonomics. And all the materials, because they were funded through a government grant, are located in one place and they're free of charge for anybody who'd like to use them. And it has a pretty good mix of academic literature and practical experience as well. In terms of some outcomes we had during this particular set of projects, I think there was some evidence of development of ergonomics capacity. The ergonomics team creation in the first Newfoundland seafood processing plant, they were able to accurately identify what was going on and what the particular risk factors were associated with the job, and even they were able to describe what the anatomical and postural issues associated with the task were, even better than some undergraduate university students, I think, in a lot of cases. They also were able, because of the formalization of the process, they implemented a line item in their occupational health and safety activities and budget for the ergonomics team. That helped them to actually propose some changes and make some changes. And they were able to implement some changes to a crab butchering workstation that led to lower reports of work-related musculoskeletal symptoms among those workers, while also maintaining their production standards. And generally, the workers were pretty satisfied with their changes. However, the problems did crop up after. The team did not stay together after the following off-season. So the idea of sustainability was pretty well absent. What we really needed here was to recognize the fact that participatory ergonomics is a wonderful tool to gather information and maintain momentum of projects, but you still need the involvement of a trained ergonomist, particularly a participatory ergonomic trained ergonomist, to take part. They need to provide training, updated training. They need to reorient projects and provide expertise to reorient what's going on with the entirety of the program. And without having that particular individual involved and able to continue on with the project, slowly the ergonomics team at that particular institute started to degrade. What I would propose here is we need perhaps a public health or publicly funded ergonomist to take part that could periodically visit to maintain things, but the team could function without them in the interim. So it would be less expensive than maintaining full consultancy to deal with the issues and still be able to get the benefits. In terms of some of the work that I did during my own PhD project, which was at that Montreal snack bar processing facility I mentioned, what we were able to do there was we created a little bit different model of an ergonomics team. We had two permanent members from for the Ergo team. One was a human resources professional and occupational health and safety director, and the other was a representative from the employee union there. Then we had rotating members who would take part in specific projects, including supervisors from a production area and some representative employees. What we did there, they had some training, then covered the 12-module training package I noted. That was covered from October 2010 to January 2011, intermittently when the team members had time to partake. And then after completing their training, I acted as a facilitator for the project, and they took on an initial intervention, where they looked at a repackaging line and tried to deal with problems that people were having on that line with their shoulder, back, and lower limb. We recruited 2 employee volunteers and 2 supervisors to be the rotating members of the ergonomics team, and they ran that project from March of 2011 to September 2011. After that, the team then decided they would run a project with less guidance from me as a facilitator and just intermittent contact, and they took on the project of assessing office workstations at that particular plant, where they looked at 9 different areas and helped overcome some of the issues that people were having with various symptoms. There was some good evidence of capacity here too. The members of the team were accurately able to identify what the problems were in terms of anatomical movements and ergonomic risk factors and postural outcomes, and they were pretty good at that, again, just like the Newfoundland team. And again, they had formalized involvement of the Ergo team in their occupational health and safety program, and they were able to propose some changes in workstation designs that could fix the problems. At the office side of things, they actually not only were they able to propose changes, but they actually bought some equipment and implemented those changes. Unfortunately, at the time I'd finished my PhD, there were still some economic issues post-recession that were hampering their ability to implement some of the changes that were suggested. So I'm not sure how that ever worked out in terms of implementing the recommendations they made for the repackaging line. But at least there was some positive changes for the office setting during this entire project. On the repackaging line, they noted there were some issues with the workstation design. And that would be consistent with what a short ergonomics consultancy with an expert-based approach would have led to. And this was checked and verified by the researchers and ergonomists involved in the project. But the involvement of the people as the participatory approach really led to some interesting outcomes. They noted that you could make any changes to the design, but really the problems with the work were also associated with the timing of the movements and the loading they had in terms of the number of movements they had to make in a set time frame. If you implemented changes to the line or implemented chairs or different seated aids to help with some of the issues, it still wouldn't be possible, because if you want to rotate your posture or change your posture throughout that time period, it is impossible without them designing the work to have a more latitude, less frequent delivery of bars and boxes and things like this. So what we needed to do, based on their suggestions, was not only change the workstation design, but increase the space, adapt the delivery system in terms of how the bars and boxes were delivered to them, increase the amount of space between employees, and change this work rotation schedule where employees would move one position down a line every 15 minutes. That didn't really do much for them because they were still doing the same tasks, and instead they suggested changing that over to be the posture rotation system. At the office, they noted that there were issues mostly with upper limb and neck pain, and they had interventions that you typically see to change screen locations and keyboard types and things of that nature. The instruction for the that they provided actually seemed to provide some nice differences, and after 3 months, 8 of the 9 employees who had been assessed no longer reported any of the symptoms they were initially experiencing. So these tools themselves and the use of them were primarily used in a food processing sector. And that's great. That's a good environment to start with. But ultimately, if we want these participatory ergonomics tools to be useful, they need to be applied in other industrial contexts. So one project we took on since I moved to Edmonton was to apply these tools at a concrete pipe production facility. Much of the initial training we were able to move through quite quickly or even skip because the company EWI Works had previous work with this company over many years, and they'd had a lot of the training that was noted in the background ergonomics training. We just need to explain to them some of the ethical considerations and interview steps and things of that nature. So we were able to do a lot of that over a 1 to 2 day period. And then we developed our team that took part, and we performed some observation of employees doing work tasks over 3 days. By analyzing video, interviewing the employees, and performing and reviewing all this in the boardroom, taking about 10 hours worth of work, the supervisors and the team that was involved really conducted basically this idea of activity-centered analysis. And while we as ergonomists provided some technical expertise, pointed out issues, and reoriented the projects where needed, they were generally able to come up with some really good ideas on their own. A list of recommendations was compiled and reviewed by the facilitators, and then a larger meeting was held with key decision makers outside of the team. And a report and set of resources was developed from that. So typically, as you'd expect, several policy changes were implemented in terms of team lifting standards, changes to worker rotation, and increased spacing, and things that you typically see in an ergonomics project. And also several engineering changes in terms of stools and ladders with larger platforms, mechanisms to raise pipes, vibration dampening gloves, slide hammers, things of this nature. But I think where the participatory piece added the most value was training on proper work techniques. Specific nuances of the work operations, little tricks that more experienced workers had gained over their time there. We were able to actually identify those with the ergo team group that we figured out, and the timing of operations, the compounds used, the strategy for placement and use of tools, and the frequency, force, and posture rotations that the more experienced workers used seemed to all contribute to them having fewer symptoms than some of the younger workers. So they were able to take that information and redevelop their training program and their orientation programs that new workers actually have when they come in. That train-to-trainer approach, where they then involve their more experienced workers, became really important to them. So this new pipe plant project was positive from my standpoint because it allowed us to use these tools in a new context. And that's important, but we also learned that we might need to be a little flexible in terms of how this is approached. We had to use a more compressed time frame, and we had to rely on some previous training. And for that, we really need to make sure that the history of the projects that are being completed at that particular enterprise are really well tracked. And instead of involving a lot of different areas from maintenance and employees, the supervisors were primarily involved in performing the assessments in this case because it was easier for them. So this proved that this PE process could be applied in more of a industrial context outside of food processing. And that's all well and good. And I think what I would like to leave you with here is this ergo team approach, and this what we came out with. This is able to identify problems and improve the ability to communicate with peers and foster participation and buy-in, and develop some pretty good solutions that fit the context of the work. But they still require some pretty significant time investments by a researcher and practitioner. And in truth, this is not something you'd want to invest in with somebody with an organization that hasn't had a previous history of developing a lot of ergonomics capacity. So, and even when you are able to develop that particular capacity, it still doesn't remove the need for an ergonomist. The ergonomist remains an integral part. The facilitator is always going to be needed to provide updated training, reorient the program, and provide technical expertise where required. And there's often some difficulty with, the ergo team being able to fit these duties in with their other production tasks as well. So what we need to do is use this idea as the foundation for a continued ergonomics program. But although it's often been suggested in literature that participatory ergonomics could help to remove the need for an ergonomist at a particular enterprise, the truth is I think the ergonomist always does have to have a role here. What I'd like to finish up with here is the idea that these tools are out there and they're useful, and I hope that they might be something that you all can use as well, but they still need to be adapted for other industrial contexts. We don't know how they're going to be useful in heavy industry. We don't know how they're going to be used in automotive sectors, for instance. So I think if you do decide to use them, we ask that you actually take them and provide some feedback to us and add some pieces and tell us what we could do so that we can improve this approach as a whole. The package themselves are available at SafetyNet's website, the www.participatoryorgonomics.mon.ca, or you can contact us at EWI Works to get a copy as well. We just ask that you cite and give feedback to the authors involved, including Dr. McKinnon, Dr. Neese, Dr. Vesna, Dr. Mulgard, and Miss Margaret Ann McCarthy. And if you'd like to discuss this or a topic related to it, feel free to email me anytime. I really appreciate the time and that you guys took to listen today. Hopefully it came across relatively clear, and if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer. Take care.
Okay, thanks very much, David. So we now have time for questions. If you can use the Q&A box, please feel free to do that. We'll look at the chat box as well, but if you can use the Q&A box, that's great. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, maybe I'll start with one, David. So
Sure.
I'm wondering if you had any tips or any things you found on the selection of team members from the organization. So, what characteristics would you look for in someone to be on your team?
No, absolutely. There's a section in the guidebook itself that goes through that exact concept. You definitely want someone who is an opinion leader, who has a history of taking part in these particular projects. And you want to make sure again, that idea of not discriminating any groups. You don't necessarily want to say, I only want experienced workers. Well, maybe you want someone who's a new employee, someone who's an experienced employee, male and female employees, people from different sections. But the general concept is you want them to be a positive person and someone who's willing to embrace change, not someone who's resistant to things that often are proposed. And we have a more well-rounded outline of that, but that certainly is in the package.
Okay, that's great. So far, I am not seeing any questions come in here.
That means it was super clear, right?
So another question I had was when you were talking about the PAC information, the PAC stuff, you talked about, or you just had a bullet point that was agreeing on operating norms. And I just wondered if you could explain what operating norms are.
Sure. So agreeing on operating norms in terms, that's more of how are you going to approach this project? You want to make sure that there's consistency. So if you're making sure that this is the chain of communication that's going to exist from the team to the occupational health and safety committee to the managers. This is the time that we're going to meet. These are the activities we're going to perform at this time. This is our time frame. And although things can be massageable and flexible, it's interesting to always have some sort of a basis in terms to agree, because if you let things kind of fly in the wind, oftentimes it'll take too much of a backseat to everything else, and the program tends to fall apart.
Great, thank you. Are you on the chat area? Can you see the chat?
I will.
Oh. You can see that there's a question there from Andrew.
Yes, I'm going to read through that. Just give me a second.
Yep. Well, David's reading, I'll just read it out loud. So, in a recent presentation by Richard Wells, he cited one of the failures of getting ergonomics accepted was the fact that ergonomists use different language than standardized OHS. which required companies to learn more terms and philosophies which they did not have time for. So how does your package sync with the current OHS environment?
That's a very, very good point, and I'll fully admit I'm not sure that it entirely does account for that fact. I think that what I would hope for is that by involving the right people, you can gain those terminologies and those standards and those ideas that are missing and have them implemented into the larger program. And I think that's where this is not a finished product. This Dr. Wells speaks very well to this point. This is very interesting. This is why we need to continue to work to integrate these things in different industrial contexts. Because if we develop a package that, let's say, worked for food processing, those particular terminologies and standards and what have you, whatever you want to term them, they won't necessarily fit for the construction world. So I think we need to be flexible and be able to develop that over time. And I'm hoping that the whole idea of involving those stakeholders can help us to achieve that.
Thank you. And Andrew, if there's anything else you want to add, just type it in.
I think Amy had a question. How difficult was it to recruit upper management? Uh, I can't see the rest of the question. Difficulty to recruit upper management. I think this is really important. We ran this project in a number of different plants. The first one actually was a plant that Dr. Vesna and Dr. Neese had done work with over a long period of time. And management understood they had previously had a history of running some ergonomics projects. So they understood what it was about. And upper management was more than willing to put their time into it. However, when we ran it at some other plants that this was their first exposure, more or less, to ergonomics, upper management didn't really understand the value of it, and they didn't really buy in at all. So I would be reluctant to use this process as an entry point in any ergonomics project. I don't think you go to a workplace and say, hi, how are you? Welcome to ergonomics. Let's start an ergonomics team. I think you need to develop a culture for it and involve the management to understand over many months and years even before you can actually engage them properly to buy into this process.
Thank you. The rest of that question was, I think you've answered it. It says, this was a difficulty we ran into with a project run by the WSIB agronomists when we existed. Without upper management participation, we had a much more difficult time implementing change.
And you'll see that as being a very consistent report across participatory research, not only in ergonomics, but in any context. Without that top level support, things don't tend to go all that well.
Other questions? Thank you from Amy.
All right. Well, thank you guys for listening. It's a big group. To 31. That's decent. That's very good.
Yeah. I think we had one more at one point. Okay, someone's typing now, so we'll wait for that. Oh, just says
You're welcome. Thank you guys.
Okay, so I think David's given us some great resources. I would really encourage you to go and take a look at those. As I mentioned before, we have tried to record this. Hopefully it'll all work out, and we'll post it within a couple weeks on the ACE website and let you know when that's up and ready to go. Also, a reminder, on June 5th, we have our next webinar, and that one will be on user experience, so a little different topic than we've had before. I'm very happy to be able to offer that. So without, I guess, any further, let me just check here, make sure there's nothing else come in. Okay, so I think that's it. Thanks so much, David, for doing that for us. And as you mentioned, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact David directly, and he will try and answer your questions as best he can, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone, and have a great weekend. Hopefully the weather is nice wherever you are.
Thanks, everyone. We'll be logging off now. Bye-bye.